Hello again, everybody. Doc Hydra here, March 14th, 2026. Um, Gonna go over something real quick here. Basically, I'm gonna do something detailed about retardant, the ammonium phosphate-based retardants that we use in the fire environment. And something that I want to point out to you guys is that down here in the logo, I don't know if you can make that out, but I've got the words cool it, retard it, dose it. So the idea is to cool the fire first, take the initial punch and heat out of it, then drop your retardant on it. And dose it does not means after the fact, but basically you should have a doser line in wherever you're going to do this ahead of time. So here's why, after 8 years of studying this, and I put together the logo, I wanted it in that way. That is the timing that I talked about in the last video. Cool it, retard it, dose it. You can't just drop retardant anywhere. The retardant has to go over the top of the water, not in front of it, not to the side of it, not behind it. Wherever you just drop the water, once you get that heat down, that temperature threshold that degrades the effectiveness of the retardant, drop your burn inhibitor directly on top. Your doser line's right there. That's the idea. Now, let me prove to you why I say that. Well, I'm going to offer up my version of proof here. Okay. Um, because we always say that fire retardant absorbs a lot of heat. Well, we don't say that. It's been said. I've heard people say that. So this is the report that I was talking to you about, the effects of ammonium sulfate and ammonium phosphate on flammability. Now, I'm going to have to move this around because my document scanner is not working all that well. So we'll bring this up here. But if you look at that USDA Forest Service research paper, INT-121 1972. And in the last video, I was wrong. I said the Rocky Mountain Ranger Station. It's not that. It was the Intermountain Forest and Ranges Experiment Station out of Ogden, Utah. But this is one of several reports that Charles George, the research scientist of the day, really did some phenomenal work. Right, basically at the same time frame that Richard Rothermel was doing his stuff. Um, it's taken me quite a bit to go through this over the years, but the more I read it, the more I keep learning new things. And then um, I'm sure after this we'll probably find out more stuff. So let's get into the abstract here of it, of the problem of retardant that you hear me talking about. But right off the bat, I want to read in this abstract here. It says. It just says that ammonium phosphate is much more effective in decreasing rate of weight loss and increasing the residue than is ammonium sulfate. So basically what they're saying is that the ammonium phosphates that they're using is better at, when it goes into its decomposition rate, which is between 150 to 200 degrees centigrade, but more closely around 194 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. As it starts to be endothermic, meaning it's absorbing heat, once it gets to a certain phase, then it starts releasing ammonia and phosphoric acid. That phosphoric acid is basically what goes out and it starts to degrade and that acid turns into a char on the outside, and that's supposed to protect it. Okay, I personally believe that okay, the specimen size that they used in the lab, and from reading the report and how they did it, Um, I can understand how they got the results that they did. I don't believe that it is um, applicable to 100,000 hour or maybe even 10,000 hour fuels. Um, so that remains to be seen. I mean, I'm not a chemist, but after spending 8 years of reading these reports and being able to follow along with the arithmetic, um, I see some issues here that I'm gonna bring up, and then you guys can be the judge of it. But at any rate, so continuing on, um, the the superior effectiveness of ammonium phosphate is probably due to the difference in thermal behavior of the two fire retardants. Now the underlying part. Um, Total decomposition of ammonium sulfate occurs prior to 450 degrees centigrade, about 250 degrees centigrade sooner than ammonium phosphate. Okay, I'm going to show you what that is a little bit later. Temperatures at the surface of the fuel bed probably are within the range of these total decomposition temperatures, okay? Now, um, that's just their little abstract, okay? So now we get in here, we got the problem, okay? So in the beginning here, it's talking about how more than 80 million gallons of fire retardant have been used in the control of forest and rangeland fires by fire control agencies throughout the United States in the last 10 years. Now, that was from 1962 to 1972 when they were doing that. They're talking about that. But here's what's interesting. Down here in the red underline, it says, it is often thought that ignitability is decreased by treating fuel with retardant chemicals such as ammonium sulfate and ammonium phosphate. However, recent empirical data indicate that the reverse, that is, less energy is necessary for ignition of treated fuel. Yeah. So we've got that. And then continuing on, there's a comment here that says, only recently has it been pointed out that retardant chemicals applied to open fuel bed fires may have similar effects on the rate of spread, but different effects on the rate of energy release. That's rather important because, according to the study, they can have a decrease in a rate of spread, but have a lot more energy output being generated. Why is that important? Okay, well, I think that's important because if we treat fuel, and we just read in the preceding page where less energy is required to ignite that treated fuel, but then it slows down its rate of spread, but it's generating a lot more energy due to the decomposition of the chemical. What's next to that untreated fuel, or what's next to that treated fuel, is untreated fuel. So if it's generating a lot of energy with a reduced rate of spread, it can ignite the adjacent fuel. That's where my theory goes. And that's what's being stated in this report right here. Okay. Um, so again, only recently has it been pointed out that retardant chemicals applied to open fuel bed fires may have similar effects on the rate of spread, but different effects on the rate of energy release. Okay, George and Blakely in 1970 is the report that those scientists did that. Because fire retardants are used to reduce fire spread and combustion rate, it is necessary for both parameters to be quantified. So then that's basically what they were doing with this report is quantifying some of these observations. Now, um, the retardant chemical, due to inherent decomposition characteristics, may only be available at given temperatures for a given time during the fire. I'm going to read that again. Retardant chemical, due to inherent decomposition characteristics, may only be available at given temperatures for a given time during the fire, thus causing different effects on the flaming and glowing process. Okay, so to interpret what that says, what they are saying is that because of the nature of the decomposition temperature ranges, okay, it can get to a certain point, the chemical starts to break down. Okay, you have your ammonium phosphate, monoammonium phosphate, and diammonium phosphate. Um, All of these are basically still ammonium phosphate based. Okay, they might have an extra salt layer or whatever in there, but it's pretty much going to be a similar element. It's all in that family. With regard to this, if our decomposition characteristic is such to where we're going to absorb some heat, start the decomposition, and the decomposition in this means that the chemical elements will start to break down because of the temperature ranges. Okay, that's what they mean by that. They start separating into their individual atomic structures. They no longer stay cohesive to multiple atomic structures into one. So once it starts to break down, then what happens is that it will start to separate the ammonia from the nitrogen, okay? Or the ammonia is comprised of nitrogen and hydrogen. So those elements will slowly start to break down. But before it gets to that phase, the guar gum or the xanthan gum, whatever they're using for the particular batch, that will break down next, and that is basically the insulative barrier, and also the think of it as like a shroud, a liner, a wrapper. It keeps everything cohesive and together, and provides kind of like the insulative layer to all this. In addition to the phosphoric acid at the lower temperature, so we have the temperature where it starts to rise, the ammonium phosphate starts to separate into the ammonia and phosphoric acid. The phosphoric acid creates the char, or helps to create the char layer on it, and then it starts to dehydrate the cellulose fuel in there, and then that continues up until a certain point to where now we've gotten into, oh, let's say the 350 to the 500 degrees centigrade range, which 500 degrees centigrade is about 932 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty much right there, you're pretty much already starting to break down. But around the 200 to 300 degree range of that gum layer, that insulative layer, that's starting to crack and erode and whatnot. So now it's able to penetrate even more. By the time the retardant gets to about the 600 degree centigrade range, it's already lost its effectiveness as a retardant because it's breaking out. So it has a very narrow temperature range. Hence the reason why I say cool it, then retard it, and dose it. So we're going to get to that in a second here. I've got another page that I want to show you guys. Ah, this is critical. In here, when they talk about the methods and the types of fuels, okay, um, previous research on the effects of fire retardants with scientists like Hardy, Rothermel, and Davis from 1962, and then Rothermel and Hardy in 1965, demonstrated the usefulness of ponderosa pine needle fuel beds, which were originally used because of their natural physical and chemical characteristics. That we're going to get to in a second here. Um, let's see, where was there? Oh, whether or not this type of fuel is representative of most forest fuel was not questioned. Now, this is critical. Underline in red here. Ponderosa pine needles alone are not representative because they contain a relatively high amount of ether extractives, approximately 10%, which apparently volatilize at low temperatures. Okay, and support combustion. Okay, so what that is saying right there is that how many of you have seen tree torching? You see, you get a little bit of heat in there. Once it goes, then poof, off it goes. That's the pine needle. That's the extractives and the resins and the oils that they're talking about that's contained within that. And that's what I also said in the last video I did, that the average ponderosa pine tree contains anywhere from between 500 to 1,000 pounds of pine needles, and you have about 9,414 BTU per pound of those pine needles. Hence, you'd need about 1,000 gallons of water per single tree, times however many trees are out there. If you've got like a, that's why crown fires become so nasty. There's so much heat in the pine needles, and that's why it largely just the heat just chars the bark, but it doesn't really. It leaves the tree still standing. That's why it volatilizes, which I think would have been a is a problem as to why they chose not to. Because if you look at it from the chemistry standpoint, um, the BTU places everything far above the decomposition rate to where you can start getting into the ammonia cracking, which is what I believe is actually happening. So we are going to we're going to talk about that too. Um, Aspen Excelsior. Well, let me back up. Furthermore, woody fuels make up a large portion of natural forest fuel and generally contain less extractives and a larger percentage of cellulose. Aspen Excelsior, back into the part I underlined. Um, this is the dimension that they used in the combustion chamber. 21 thousandths of an inch by 21 thousandths of an inch by 3 inches. Aspen Excelsior. Think of aspen pads in a swamp cooler. That's about the thickness and the diameter that they use for this testing. So consider we're going to treat a very fine fuel uniformly with a retardant. And then we're going to ignite this at a controlled rate, and we're going to have it at 5 to 8.5% fuel moisture. And then we're going to run it through the sled and see what happens. That's essentially what's going on here. So to me, it would be very easy to explain why we would have a reduction in the rate of spread and at the same time create this char layer, but also become more exothermic. And the other report talks about being exothermic, but this one doesn't really do that. Then here, only recently has it been pointed out that retardant chemicals applied to open fuel bed fires may have similar effects on the rate of spread, but different effects on the rate of energy release. Yeah. So basically, it can have, so ammonium sulfate and ammonium phosphate can have a similar effect in the reduction rate of spread, but the energy output is higher in ammonium phosphate than ammonium sulfate. Um, the retardant chemical, due to inherent decomposition characteristics, may only be available at given temperatures for a given time during the fire, thus causing different effects on the flaming and glowing process. Again, once it reaches that point and then you get the ammonia cracking and everything else that takes place, you can get a more volatile output versus the input because the fires that are burning now are so hot that it rapidly decomposes it, separates everything into its elements, and then finally reaches a point, I believe, folks, that we're seeing the off-gassing of hydrogen. I firmly believe that based upon the video that I told you about in the last video I made, to where the fire was burning through a retardant line, you see that effect, which is indicative of what this is saying right here. Okay, so let's get to the next one. With another part in here. And then the discussion is where we're at now. It's on page 18 of the report. It says, when attempting to characterize the effects of retardant chemicals on flammability, the measurement of 3 perimeters provides a more complete picture than does the use of a single perimeter. For example, the study has shown that chemicals can have similar effects on the rate of spread of a fire while having greatly different effects on the energy release rate and residue. The differences in their effects on glowing combustion are greater. Okay. Um, we missed an underline there. So the results of this study indicate that although there are significant differences in the effects of ammonium sulfate and phosphate have on flaming combustion, the differences in their effects on glowing combustion are much greater. So in other words, they have similar effects of the reduction in rate of spread, but totally different, or a much greater difference in the effect of its energy output, how much it's generating. It is theorized that the difference in the effects of these chemicals have on glowing combustion is due to the difference in the availability of the inorganic fraction of retardant chemical. Um, Figure 17 shows thermal decomposition curves for ammonium sulfate and ammonium phosphate. Okay, the curves show that ammonium sulfate has completely decomposed by about 425 degrees, while ammonium phosphate decomposition is not complete until around 675 degrees centigrade. This suggests that by the time the fire has spread through the ammonium sulfate treated bed, and prior to the majority of the glowing combustion process, the ammonium sulfate may have decomposed. Okay, so in other words, just saying that the ammonium sulfate decomposes completely before the ammonium phosphate. Okay, um, here's this graph. So what you're looking at is right here, this NH4SO4. This is the ammonium sulfate. Okay, we don't use too much of the ammonium sulfate anymore. The ammonium phosphate is what I've got here. This right here is what it is. So now over here, weight remaining in percent. So basically they're judging the effectiveness of the retardant based upon the decomposition weight or the char residue of the fuel. So basically what they're saying is that the more weight of a particular fuel specimen that they have over a given temperature, the better the characteristic is for this. That's what the claim is, okay? Now, this here is thermal decomposition curves for ammonium phosphate and ammonium sulfate. Heated at, and I want you to pay attention to this, 25 degrees centigrade per minute in a flow of 1 liter per minute of air. So in other words, they were flowing air, okay, or it was heated and being increased 25 degrees per minute, or 25 degrees centigrade per minute, every minute until it got to the decomposition temperature of the ammonium phosphate, which is up here at, this is 700, this is about 675. Now, what's interesting is that the ammonium sulfate, however, will maintain its 100% weight characteristic all the way up until it gets to about 200 and we'll say 225 to 250 degrees centigrade. But by the time it's hit 300 degrees centigrade, you can see it's already starting to drop, but it drops very radically. And hence, they were saying at about 425 degrees centigrade, it's completely decomposed. Okay. But the ammonium phosphate can only maintain up until about 150 degrees centigrade. Then it starts the decomposition process. So basically, that's the way to look at this. So the ammonium phosphate is starting its decomposition process sooner, but it lasts longer in the chain. That's what the claim is. Okay. So ammonium phosphate, on the other hand, might still be present, altering glowing combustion as well as flaming combustion. Again, ammonium phosphate might still be present, altering glowing combustion as well as flaming combustion. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what they're saying, okay? Using ponderosa pine needle fuel beds similar to those of this study found that, now this is the critical part. Now we're back to the pine needles. Using ponderosa pine needle fuel beds similar to those of this study found the average temperature within the combustion zone to be 867 degrees centigrade. Now, that's about 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the decomposition temperature of ammonium phosphate. So in other words, if you were to look up the term ammonia cracking and see what it takes to separate nitrogen from hydrogen and just leave hydrogen so you have a hydrogen flammable gas, that temperature is well above it. So something to think about. It is likely that most of the ammonium sulfate would decompose during the passage of the flame. Okay, so now they're talking about on that one. That's the difference between the two. So based upon the graph, that's why they're making the statement that the ammonium sulfate as a fire's coming through. So you got to kind of picture this. Fire's coming through a fire line. Okay, if my pen is the fire line and my hand is the fire, by the time the fire gets through that, it would have decomposed and essentially reached that decomposition threshold for everything. Now the retardant is no longer effective at all. It's just going to keep right on chugging along. That's the end net effect of all of this, is that once the decomposition temperature is reached and everything breaks down, it's no longer effective. It's like it doesn't even exist. The difference that I am saying, in my own opinion, through the last 8 years of study on the ammonium phosphates, is that without cooling the fire first and just putting retardant out in front and hoping that it works, um, you're not solving any problems. You're actually, in my opinion, you're creating a problem whether you realize it or not, because you haven't taken the heat out of the fire to allow the retardant to be more effective. If you do that, if you cool it first, like what I've got in my logo, you can bring that temperature threshold down so that the retardant has the ability to do what it was actually chemically designed to do. That's the idea there. So this graph, this is the one right here. So there is another graphic there, but it talks about, or it shows that if you had 8 grams or 12 grams, we'll continue here. When attempting to characterize the effects of retardant chemicals on flammability, the measurement of 3 parameters provide a more complete picture. Okay, so um, yeah, so we already read that. Okay, yeah, page 19. So let me go back to, let's go back to some graphs here. And bear with me here. So here we go. So this is what they were talking about. And then here's basically the data chamber. So this is where you can see the fire back in the combustion chamber. And then they had all the recording instruments or whatever, and they were running the test fires through. Um, and this is basically how they did it. Pretty fascinating when you stop to think about it. But what I want you to see here, so you've got a rate of spread in feet per minute. Okay, so almost all the way up to like 180. Not 180. It looks like I was looking for a decimal point, but I'm not seeing a decimal point here. Okay, so I do see a decimal point. So 1.2, 1.6, and 2.0 feet per second. So that would conclude for me that this would have to be a point 0.2, point 0.4, point 0.6, point 0.8 foot per second. Okay, so if we get up here to like 2.5 feet, 1.7, 1.8 feet per second, um, with almost no treatment whatsoever. But if we put grams per square foot of retardant, then you can see that they're showing that there is a reduction in the rate of spread. Okay. However, they're not really showing the energy output of what that means. So 18 grams of chemical. I did. I did a chart here. So 18 grams of a chemical works out to the thickness of about 8 thousandths of an inch of a layer. Okay. So to put that in perspective, if you have a coverage level of 8, which means 8 gallons per 100 square feet, and you break that down and convert the gallons to ounces and then the ounces into a height for the square foot, you have basically 128 thousandths of an inch. So a little over an eighth of an inch in thickness at 8 gallons. Okay, so 18 grams is hardly nothing, especially when you're talking about that would work out to basically 0.63 ounces per square foot is what 18 grams all the way over here. So it's not much. It's a really super thin layer. Now, to add more, the last piece here of all of this, and to kind of tie it all in. So let's look at thermal decomposition, okay? So the effectiveness of ammonium phosphate, typically used as a flame retardant, is highly dependent on temperature because its functionality relies on thermal decomposition. It does not have a single operating temperature, but rather an active range, and that range is what I was just telling you. Okay. The thermal decomposition range. Okay, ammonium phosphate, particularly common forms like monoammonium phosphate, which is the MAP, and diammonium phosphate, which is DAP, which is not listed right here, but um, begins its effective work as a flame retardant when heated to approximately 200 degrees to 300 degrees centigrade. Okay, so but once it gets above that temperature, then it starts to fall off. So it's got a very narrow temperature range as to where it's effective at. That's the point I want you guys to have as the takeaway. So in this temperature range, the material undergoes an endothermic decomposition, which means it's absorbing heat. It releases ammonia and produces phosphoric acid. The flame retardancy, the phosphoric acid, then acts as a catalyst, promoting the dehydration of material like wood or cellulose to form a protective char layer. This char acts as a physical barrier that insulates the underlying material from heat and prevents the release of flammable gases. Okay, time out, stop right there. That preventing the release of flammable gases, I don't believe that that is going to be that effective when you start getting into your 100,000 hour fuels and you've got a lot of intensity and a lot of heat buildup in there because there's so much decomposition that's already gone on. The guar gum and the xanthan gum that would normally hold all this together, that's gone. Um, so I don't see that as being that effective once it gets past that threshold. But again, that's my opinion. So temperature sensitivity by application. So the effective and relevant temperatures. So for flame retardancy, 200 to 500 degrees centigrade. So by 500 degrees centigrade, as we've already seen in um, this report, this report, um, it's already it's already well on its way to being ineffective. The chemical synthesizing process, that's between 150 to 180. So that's the optimal range for reaction and granulation, is what they're saying. Now, it's not stable at high heat because it functions by decomposing. Ammonium phosphate is not heat stable at very high temperatures. Once it has fully decomposed between 5 and 600 degrees centigrade, its ability to provide further flame retardancy is exhausted, and only stable mineral residues remain. Okay? And then it just talks about storage and handling and whatnot. Okay, so here's the takeaway with all this. Despite all these problems, and I'm not being a naysayer and saying, no, we shouldn't be using retardant or anything like that. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm trying to get everybody to understand is that if we want to be a lot more effective, cool, then retard. Don't retard, then cool, because you haven't done any good. You have to swap it. Cool it first, but cool by the right amount, okay? Base it off of the thermodynamic output of the fire, like what I've been trying to say. And then once you do that, then take your ammonium phosphate and drop it direct over the wet line that you just made. Have your crews in place. You should be good to go. Give it a shot. See what happens. Engineers make it happen.